Good evening. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Louisville Seminary's Graweyer Lecture and Religion. Are you excited to be here? All right, we are really honored and privileged to have you all join us. So for all who are joining us in person and some of you who are joining us online, welcome again. Since 1990, Louisville Presbyterian Theological Seminary and the University of Louisville have partnered to recognize influencers from around the world who offer rich insights into the relationship between human beings and the divine, and the ways this relationship may empower all of humanity to attain wholeness, integrity, and meaning. Charles Grawemeyer was a person of remarkable vision who deeply believed that great ideas should be understandable to anyone with a general knowledge and not the private treasures of just academics. Now, we like academics, but it shouldn't be their private treasure. It is in this spirit that Charlie Grawemeyer established the award in religion, as well as awards in music composition, ideas improving world order, education, and psychology. These awards serve as his mechanism for encouraging world-shaping achievement by encouraging great ideas. The ideas that our Grawemeyer Religion Award winners share challenge us to take a deeper look at who we are and what we as people of God believe to be true about ourselves and the world in which we live. It is through this challenge that we find affirmation, or at the very least, cause for further examination. And so it is with tremendous care and respect that Grawemeyer Award winners are considered and selected. Tonight, we will hear from someone who is certainly worthy to be included among the giants who have been recognized in the past. This group includes Eboo Patel, James Cone, Diana Eck, and so many other renowned thinkers. So with that, I would like to invite Tyler Mayfield, Louisville Seminary's very able A.B. Rhodes Professor of Old Testament and the Faculty Director of the Grawemeyer Award in Religion, to introduce the winner of the 2023 Grawemeyer Award in Religion. Welcome, Tyler.
Good evening and welcome. Thank you all for coming tonight for this special occasion. Let me begin with a few logistics. After tonight's lecture, there will be a time for question and answer. So if you are present here in Caldwell Chapel and you would like to ask a brief question, please raise your hand at the appropriate time and one of our seminary students will bring you a microphone. If you are joining us online, then we welcome your questions there as well in the chat window. I'll also add that if you provided your name and email address to us, then you have been entered into a drawing for a $50 Amazon gift card. So if you pre-registered for the event, you are already a part of the drawing, and if you didn't pre-register, then you can simply register with the slip of paper that you received upon your arrival. We'll also send out an evaluation form next week, and we would love your feedback about this event. After our question and answer time, our honored guests will be signing books out in the chapel foyer in the narthex. You may purchase a copy of her award-winning book there. We are so pleased to have Carmichael's Bookstore with us tonight, selling copies of her book. And now let me introduce our lecturer and award winner. How do we really know that God cares when black people are still getting killed? How long do we have to wait for the justice of God? These two poignant questions from her young adult son led Kelly Brown Douglas on a faith-seeking understanding journey, a journey from what she calls the crucifying realities of Black death to find the resurrection hope of Black life. Resurrection Hope explores America's corrupted moral imaginary by examining the roots of anti-Blackness in Western American and Christian thought. Douglas argues that our moral vision simply cannot hold a vision in which Black lives matter as much as white lives, let alone serve as a symbolic representation for all lives, and thus what it means to be human. I highlight tonight her book chapter entitled, "It's About Good White Christians," which seeks to comprehend how white ways of knowing and white standards of reality and truth blind presumably good people with good commitments to social justice, blinds them to the complex feelings of Black people who live with their backs against the wall. Douglas argues that the silence of good white Christians is explained not by white supremacist values or Christian values, but by the conceptual limitations inherent in the white gaze. The conceptual limitations inherent in the white gaze. The very Reverend Dr. Kelly Brown Douglas is Dean of Episcopal Divinity School and the Bill and Judith Moyers Chair in Theology at Union Theological Seminary in the city of New York. She also serves as the canon theologian at the Washington National Cathedral and as theologian in residence at Trinity Church, Wall Street. This year, she will celebrate 40 years of ordination as an Episcopal priest. When she was ordained, she was only one of 5 Black women Episcopal priests nationwide at the time. We are delighted to have Reverend Dr. Kelly Brown Douglas with us this evening to present her lecture on her recent book. Dr. Douglas, will you please come forward for the presentation? Reverend Dr. Kelly Brown Douglas, on behalf of Louisville Presbyterian Theological Seminary and the University of Louisville, it is my joy and delight, it is an honor to present you with the 2023 Grawemeyer Award in Religion.
My goodness, my heart is fluttering. Thank you so much. Thank you all for being here on this evening. And let me thank the Grawemeyer family, as well as the University of Louisville and Louisville Presbyterian Theological Seminary for the honor of this award. And I thank Mr. Marion Hambrick, the Executive Director of the Grawemeyer Award, for the gracious hospitality and again for being a steward in the honor of this award. I indeed want to thank the seminary and university community for what has been a warm and welcoming week. I especially must call out the students whom I have engaged with throughout this week. They have been at once engaging and inspiring. And I would be remiss without thanking Dr. Tyler Mayfield, who has not simply been hospitable, but gracious. Thank you for your graciousness. We never come to these moments alone, and so it is that I have not come to this moment alone, but I have come here because of the support of many family and friends, many of whom joined me on Tuesday evening at the awards banquet, and I thank them again on this evening. And there was one who came with me on that evening who's, because of my nerves, I failed to mention by name and to thank. And it was someone who was very special to me, so I'm going to take this time to thank her before my lecture this evening, and that is my friend and my bishop of the Washington, D.C. Diocese, Mary Ann Buddy. Her leadership, her witness, and her friendship has been for me a source of learning, a source of growth, and a source of hope. The Grawemeyer is an award given for ideas. And to be sure, the ideals that I have been able to nurture over the years emerge from the well of ideals that is the Society of Study of Black Religion. Because of them, and when I was a young scholar, I was affirmed by the Society of Study of Black Religion, and I was challenged and I learned from those who went before me in that society. And so they gather on this weekend, but I bring them with me to this lecture tonight. And I thank the Society of Study of Black Religion for continuing to challenge all of us with new ideas. And so as a member of that society, it was so special to me to have Dean Mumford introduce me on this night. Thank you, Dean Mumford. And so let me begin. Tonight I'd like to speak for a few minutes, maybe not so few, but on the urgency of hope. The urgency of hope. We have come to this hallowed spot to remind America of the fierce urgency of now. This is no time to engage in the luxury of cooling off or to take the tranquilizing drug of gradualism. Now is the time to make real the promises of democracy. Now is the time to lift our nation from the quicksands of racial injustice. Now is the time to make justice a reality for all of God's children. This was the urgent message that Martin Luther King Jr. delivered to the nation 60 years ago on that hot 28th day in August as he stood at the Lincoln Memorial. Some 4 years later, on April 4th, a year to the date before he was assassinated, he repeated this call as he recognized the interlocking realities of racism, classism, and militarism, and thus denounced the Vietnam War from the pulpit of Riverside Church. He said then, "We are confronted with the fierce urgency of now." 60 years after King first challenged the nation with the urgency of now, to end the racism which prevented it from living into his dream, where children, he said, will not be judged for the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. 60 years later, what for King was an urgency of now is what I call today an urgency of hope. It was this urgency for hope that compelled the writing of my book, Resurrection Hope, A Future Where Black Lives Matter. For in the midst of two raging pandemics that were disproportionately ravaging Black lives, COVID-19 and racial injustice, not to speak of my son's persistent question to me, do you think Black lives will ever really matter in this nation? I found myself on the precipice of hopeless despair, with words from W.E.B. Du Bois' Litany to Atlanta invading my prayers. Tell us the plan, give us the sign, keep not thou silent, O God. These words spoke to my urgency for hope. However, as I would soon discover, this urgency was not mine alone. Indeed, the urgency for hope has become even more profound since the writing of this book. I felt it when I visited a middle school where in the space of a couple of weeks, some of the black students were confronted with pictures of monkeys on their lockers, and another black boy was referred to as a monkey by a classmate. An urgency for hope. I heard it in the voice and words of a black mother on a news broadcast a few weeks ago as she described an incident in her children's preschool where the preschool staff painted kids in blackface for a Black History Month activity. I thought we would have more time before these sort of things or racism or microaggressions would have to be experienced by our children, this mother said, fighting back tears. So the fact that you can't, she continued, I feel like I can't protect my children from what's happening is probably the most disappointing and upsetting of all of this. An urgency for hope. It left me in tears as I watched the video of Tyree Nichols being beaten to death by Memphis police officers just blocks from his home. An urgency for hope. Indeed, there has been no question that I have been asked more, especially by college students of color, out of their own urgency for hope than the question, Dr. Brown Douglas, they ask, where do you find hope? Where indeed do we find hope? Even after King's urgent call, the violence that is pervasive, systemic, and structural racialized inequities persist in almost every segment of our living, from housing to healthcare, education to employment, policies to policing. Where do we find hope when simply living while Black means facing incessant microaggressions, be it in a preschool or in a park? Where do we find hope when our Black children are disproportionately trapped in conditions which portend their death, not their life and well-being? Moreover, even if we are to find hope, what difference does it make, given the intransigence of racism in our country that every day threatens the life possibilities of our children of color? Is hope more than rhetorical theological palliative given to those who endure the interminable violence that is racial injustice? And what might the gospel have to say about all of this? These are the questions that I will explore this evening, not for the purpose of providing definitive answers, but rather to provoke a conversation, even if just within ourselves, regarding the meaning and implications of an urgency for hope in this our time of being bogged down, as King would say, in the quicksands of racial injustice. I will begin by examining what precisely these quicksands look like for us today. That is, I will examine the persistent realities of racial injustice that creates the urgency itself. That which fuels the urgency for hope are two racialized dynamics constitutive to the fabric of this nation: whiteness and anti-Blackness. As I have described in my book, Resurrection Hope, the whiteness that is intrinsic to America's identity is about more than a biological or ethnic given, though it is related to both. Whiteness, as it shapes this nation's fundamental character, is a socially constructed demarcation of race that serves as a badge of privilege and power. To be raced white as typically predicated upon biological and ethnic givens, is to have access to social, historical actualities of privilege and power. The privileges and power accorded to those who are raised white is protected by a social, political, economic web of systemic, structural, and ideological constructs best described as white supremacy. This multi-nefarious web of white supremacy essentially protects the myth of inherent white superiority by granting certain privileges to those raised white and not to others. These privileges are at once social, political, economic, cultural, ideological. It is in this way that whiteness signals the privileged dominant caste of persons in our society, while blackness signals the disadvantaged subjugated class. Now, to be sure, for many today, talking about white supremacy, even to name it, reflects unacceptable, they call it wokeness, which for some amounts to race baiting and shaming white people, as if talking about or naming white supremacy is itself racist, amounting to nothing less than anti-white racism. In actual fact, however, to not name or talk about white supremacy is indeed one of white supremacy's evasions, allowing it to fester and to thrive with impunity. Now, as much as white supremacy's protection of whiteness is the fundamental driver of racial injustice in this nation, it does not fully account for the unrelenting assaults on Black lives, even during periods when the nation is seemingly in a time of racial reckoning. If we are to understand this, then we must recognize an anti-Black narrative embedded in this nation's collective psyche, which compels almost viscerally violent responses to Black bodies, as well as renders Black people acutely vulnerable to crucifying systemic and structural racial injustice. This anti-Black narrative has deep roots within ancient Western thought and even within the Christian theological infrastructure. This narrative casts Black people as inferior beings, ruled by uncontrollable sexualized passions with little or no rational capacity. Consequently, Black people are perceived as little more than dangerous predatory beasts, likely to erupt with little provocation into violent behaviors. This anti-Black narrative has become as much a part of America's collective psyche that assaults Black bodies as has whiteness and white supremacy. And it is because of this psyche that Black bodies have virtually become a part of the, assaulting Black bodies, has virtually become a part of the normal rhythm of life in this nation. To be sure, this anti-Black narrative accounts for, even as it perpetuates, a deep-seated fear, if not contempt, for Blackness itself. And so it is no wonder that studies have revealed that Black children are perceived as dangerous and adult-like as early as 5 years of age. If at 5 years old, a Black child is perceived as dangerous, then it is all but inevitable that by 15 or 25 years old, one is perceived as nothing less than monstrous and lethal. Hence, the microaggressive panic and deadly force that is routinely directed at Black youth and young adults. The point of the matter is, that which shapes this urgency for hope about which I speak is the interface of whiteness, that is white supremacy, with anti-Blackness. As such, not only are social, political, economic systems, structures, and institutions, as well as laws and policies, have been shaped by white supremacist anti-Blackness. But perhaps most troubling of all, so too has our nation's prevailing gaze. Our collective capacity to see and to know has been controlled by a white gaze, which results in compounding moral harm that stifles our moral imaginary and our empathetic capacity, the latter of which I have come to appreciate since the writing of my book. But now let me turn to this compounding moral harm, beginning with how it impacts the moral imaginary. There is no denying it. There is a prevailing white gaze that functions at every level of our shared lives in this nation. This gaze sets the standard for whose knowledge is accepted for interpreting and evaluating reality. It determines the normative story through which to judge and evaluate information regarding shared history and even shared experiences. It is the privileged gaze through which all public knowledge, be it knowledge of the past or the present, is to be assessed. It is the gaze that determines whose truth is to be admitted, whose truth is to be believed. Specifically, when it comes to the controlling gaze of our nation, any disconfirming information when it comes to the legitimacy for the preeminence of whiteness is filtered out or marginalized. This gaze does not accommodate anything that challenges an assessment of the American story as anything other than a white story. Philosopher Charles Mills might describe it as a part of a white non-knowing, wherein, he says, the white delusion of racial superiority insulates itself against refutation. Now, as is the case with the construct of whiteness itself, this privileged gaze does not function alone. It interacts with and reinforces the anti-Black narrative. Black knowing, even if it is an interpretation of a Black experience or of Black history, is discredited in advance as being suspect. The interface of the anti-Black narrative with the privileged white gaze literally renders the notion of Black knowing an oxymoron. Essentially, Black people and those raised Black, people of color in general, have no authority when it comes to knowledge production. There is no better illustration of this than the attack on the New York Times 1619 Project, curated by Nicole Hannah-Jones. In fewer than 100 pages, this project dared to challenge the privileged gaze of whiteness when it comes to the nation's story. Moreover, it did so by placing Blackness at the center of the story. Thus, invariably, the 1619 Project was attacked as racist propaganda, not a worthy source for historical knowledge. It was therefore thus caricatured as un-American, unpatriotic, and even treasonous. Perhaps needless to say, the privileged white gaze has far-reaching implications for the nation's social, political, and cultural realities, which routinely play out in policies and laws. To reiterate, the white privileging ensures that a white supremacist agenda will continue to be enacted on multiple levels across generations. And it is here that we began to see the disquieting moral harm of this gaze. For to reiterate, it impacts both a people's moral imaginary and empathetic capacity. Now let us turn to this, looking first at what this gaze means for the moral imaginary. As I have identified in my book, the imaginary is different from the imagination. It is suggestive of more than an ideal or even a vision. The moral imaginary suggests the nation's moral impulse. It is the reflexive moral response, that is, the nation's organic, instinctive reaction to social justice and issues and concerns, to notions of right and wrong. Essentially, the moral imaginary is that palpable yet imperceptible force that defines the way in which a nation intuitively and sometimes unwittingly perceives and responds to matters of injustice, as well as the way it envisions and enacts justice. The moral imaginary is conspicuously shaped by the group that has been historically, culturally, and socially dominant in the nation. That is the privileged group, the group with the privileged gaze. The point of the matter is that as whiteness sets the norm of authoritative knowing, defining the nation's prevailing gaze, it invariably influences judgments concerning right and wrong, justice and injustice. For just as it determines whose knowledge has authority, it also determines whose voice has moral efficacy. Black moral authority, as well as the moral authority of others not raced white, again, people of color in general, becomes virtually impossible. Now, this is not just theoretical conjecture by an academic. It plays itself out in the real world, in real lives, every day. I will never forget an incident I speak about in my book that took place during my son's middle school years. A little white female student accused him of verbally abusing her with language I had never heard my son use and doubted that at that time he even knew. The white female director of the school immediately believed my son's accuser, despite the fact that my own son had never been in trouble at the school, whereas the little girl had. Not even the testimony of two black teachers who witnessed part of the interaction could convince the director that the girl's accusation was false. I was called by one of the black teachers to come to the school immediately because my son was about to be unjustly suspended. It was not until the girl's mother, though she was not a witness to the event, said that she believed my son was being truthful. Not until then did the director rescind the suspension, though without an apology to my son or consequences, as far as I know, for the girl who had falsely accused him. Only another white person could invalidate the girl's story. Now, this incident was troubling on several levels, not the least of which was the moral harm done to the little girl, as seen in the fact that already implanted within her consciousness was a sense of a privileged gaze that provided her with a sense of moral authority that permitted her to falsely accuse a black boy of something and know that she could probably get away with it, and she almost did. Her sense of right and wrong was distorted, as was that of the school director's sense of justice. For the school director could only perceive justice as vindication of the little white girl, which eliminated the possibility of my son's innocence and eliminated the possibility of an apology to him. This type of incident is not unusual, and in fact, incidents such as these have an historical counterpart in the courtroom. There is a long-standing pattern of black testimony not being taken as seriously or even being invalidated, especially if it is counter to white testimony. All of this reflects a moral imaginary shaped by a gaze that won't allow for black truth, black knowing, and especially a black truth that does not sustain white moral authority. One that equates, that is, justice with white privilege. Now, beyond the moral harm that the privileged white gaze does to our moral imaginary, since writing Resurrection Hope, I have come to recognize a similar harm in regard to empathetic capacity. This recognition emerged as I continued to try and process the ways in which black lives, especially those of our children, have been constantly assaulted by the violence of anti-black white supremacy. And as I said before, even during a time of racial reckoning, I have found myself asking over and over again, how can people do this? Why cannot people see that the Briannas and the Tyrees are somebody's precious children? Why can people not see that our children, our black children, are not dangerous beasts? Why can people not see that our black children are actually human beings with bodies that need care, with hearts that need love, with dreams that need to be fulfilled? the lack of empathy was for me incomprehensible. Even in knowing the anti-Black white supremacist dynamics that control the gaze and shapes the nation's moral imaginary, I still found it hard to comprehend how human beings could treat other human beings, could treat children with such utter disregard just because they are Black. And so it has been in seeking an answer to this moral disregard for our children that I have come to recognize that the moral harm created by a white anti-Black gaze is not simply in the way it compromises our moral imaginary, but also in the way it profoundly diminishes the capacity to empathize with those who are not raced white. The point is that as long as the prevailing gaze in this country negates the value of Black knowing, negates the value of Black experience, the value of Black truth, the value of Black moral authority, then valuing Black life is virtually impossible. As the white gaze interfaces with anti-Blackness, it nullifies the golden rule from being applied to Black people. It is what Catholic ethicist Brian Massengale described in a recent conversation as an atrophy of empathy. It is what James Baldwin recognized when he said, and I quote him, "I'm terrified at the moral apathy, the death of the heart, which is happening in my country. White people," he said, "have deluded themselves for so long that they really don't think I'm human. And I base this on their conduct, not on what they say. And this means that they have become in themselves moral monsters," end quote. Now, whether or not moral monsters, for sure, the lack of empathetic capacity for Black people, for Black children, suggests the presence of severe moral harm for those whom the white gaze has not been challenged or interrupted. It cannot be said enough. A white gaze severely undermines, if not prevents, the ability to have empathy for those not raced white, especially for Black human beings. And as long as this is the case, systemic, structural, and fatal violence perpetrated upon Black lives, upon the lives of our children, will continue virtually unabated. Hence, the urgency for hope. Now, before exploring what hope looks like in this context, it is important to point out, as I stand here in this religious institution as a recipient of the Grawemeyer Award for Religion, that the urgency of hope is ever more pressing for religious leaders, scholars, institutions, for those who claim to be religious. To identify as religious means that we have variously asked the question, is there more to life than this? That is, than this finite, capricious reality with its finite understandings of justice and freedom. And so to identify as religious is to have answered, yes, there is more to life than this. Thus, as religious people, leaders, scholars, and institutions, we are accountable to the more that is God's freedom, the more that is God's justice, the more that is God's promised future. We are not to be gatekeepers of an unjust status quo, but rather we are to provide a gateway of thought to a more just future. Our task, borrowing from the words of Peruvian liberation theologian Gustavo Gutierrez, is to reflect upon a forward-directed action, he says, that penetrates the present reality, driving toward the future. This brings us to the matter of hope itself. What is it? Hope is not a rhetorical, theological palliative to ease the pain of unjust suffering. Neither is it passive, wishful thinking. Rather, hope is concrete, it's active, it's transformative. For it is found in that which resists and defies anything that opposes or prevents us from driving history toward the future that is God's promise for us. Hope is found in those moments when the just future breaks in through our actions and our practices of just relationship. Hope is found in the instances where the promise of life breaks in to disrupt the realities that portend death. For those of us who are Christian, there is something deeply Christological about hope. For to affirm Jesus as Christ is to recognize him as the bearer of God's rule. That is, the bearer of God's just future, as was perfectly revealed through Jesus' life and ministry, as he stood over and against the ideologies, principalities, and powers that opposed the rule of God, which was just. And in so doing, Jesus was the hope, for as Howard Thurman would say, the hope for the disinherited in his time, breaking into the conditions that fostered their death. He was the hope with the promise of new life, a life where they would be free from the crucifying realities that defined their living. Jesus was nothing less than hope incarnate. And so, what does all of this mean for us? Here we are. How are we to hope in this our time? My friends, hope is found in the resistance and the protest against that which stands in opposition to all that which diminishes or negates the opportunities for persons to grow into the fullness of whomever God has created them to be. Hope is found in ways in which people advocate for and foster the abundance of life that is God's to be shared by all, which means creating spaces of freedom and justice and empathy for those who have been denied such things in our society, in our world. For us to hope, especially as religious leaders, scholars, and institutions, is for us to work to repair the breach between our unjust present and God's just future. In the words of Mahatma Gandhi, for us to hope is to fight for and to be that change that we want to see. It is for us who are Christians to be, as the presiding bishop of the Episcopal Church, Michael Curry, has urged us to be, a part of the Jesus movement, which means to be an embodied witness to the justice and love that was God. That is, to be embodied signs of hope, as Jesus was hope incarnate. The urgency of hope, therefore, in this our quicksand of racial injustice is the urgency to act, to contest, to oppose, and to stand against anti-black white supremacy in the multifarious ways in which it negates the value and worth of black lives, even as we stand for a more humane, more empathetic world and society. Hope, my friends, shows up when we show up, standing against that which God opposes and standing up for that which God promises. Hope is not about our words and our intentions. Rather, it is about our actions and our commitments. Now, as I bring this to a close, I want to speak for just a moment to what, for me, is in this present moment one of the most urgent calls for hope. For there is nothing more urgent than to act when moral harm is being perpetuated on our children. My sense of hopelessness, and thus the urgency for hope, is triggered every time I read or hear a report of the way in which the history, the stories, the experiences and struggles for justice by people of color, especially black people, is being removed from school curriculums and expunged from our nation's story, accused of being, as I read in a story today, quote, Orwellian, dividing us into oppressors and the oppressed, making white children feel uncomfortable. Hearing what is happening in some of our local school districts reminds me of one of the responses from the United Daughters of the Confederacy, the UDC, after the Civil War. After the collapse of the Confederacy, the UDC was not content with simply erecting stone monuments as a way of honoring the Confederate soldiers and promoting the narrative that the Confederate cause was a just and honorable cause. Instead, they were also determined to create what some have called living monuments that would keep the Confederate cause alive. Thus, the UDC developed educational materials, espousing a lost cause version of history to be distributed in schools. It also developed instructional material for children of the Confederacy chapters, which the UDC had established for children 6 to 16 years of age. Again, all in an effort to indoctrinate a generation of children so they would grow up defending a pro-Confederacy version of history and thus continue an anti-Black white supremacist legacy. Living monuments. That, the 1619 Project, critical race theory and versions of history that talk about racial injustice, let alone mention race, is being attacked and expunged from various school curriculums, is in effect the 21st century version of what the UDC educational program was trying to do: perpetuate an anti-Black white gaze. And make no mistake about it, to do such a thing is to morally harm our children. And so it should be of no surprise when children make Black History Month cards that addresses their Black classmates as, quote, their favorite cotton pickers, or, quote, their favorite monkeys, as was recently the case in a California school. Hence, an urgency for hope. Responding to the urgency of hope means that we must, with intention, work to resist and interrupt the white gaze, so to create living monuments to reflect God's more just future. If we expect the next generation to be any better than our generation at fostering racial justice, then we must change the stories we tell them about who we are as a people and nation and who we can become. The point of the matter is, as long as the story that is passed from one generation to another is the same old story, defined by a white anti-Black gaze, then it becomes virtually impossible to chart a different course for the future. From generation to generation, the moral imaginary as well as empathetic regard for others will remain captive to the false narratives of history, and thus captive to white supremacist anti-Black notions of what just relationships look like. There is an urgency for hope. And inasmuch, my friends, as there is a movement within our schools and society to maintain a white gaze, then it is left to those who are religious leaders and institutions to stand in the breach and to end the cycle of moral harm, if you will, between our unjust present and God's just future by bringing those subjugated and marginalized voices, stories, histories, and experiences to the forefront of our institutions in what we teach, in the symbols of fabric of our architecture, as well as making the voices of the marginalized the preferential option from which we help our communities understand the nature of injustice and thus the meaning of justice in our world. For here's the thing. It is only when those who have been on the underside of justice began to experience justice that we will know that we are at least on the way to the future that God promises. Civil rights and social justice organizer Ella Baker put it this way: oppressed people, she said, whatever their level of formal education, have the ability to understand and interpret the world around them, to see the world for what it is, and move to transform it. The point for us is this: Not only have the subjugated experienced the raw realities of injustice, thus know the extent of transformation needed to realize justice, but historically speaking, those on the underside of the anti-black white supremacist gaze typically have not been enraptured by that gaze. Consequently, they have been able to see beyond the possibilities of a moral imaginary that equates white privilege and power with justice. They have been able to envision a justice, a future defined by God's justice, a future in which the sacred humanity of each person is honored and respected. It is this transcendent vision that has in fact inspired them to struggle for freedom and justice in the first place. And it is for this reason that in the Exodus, it was the cries of the Israelites that God responded to, identifying with them in their struggle to be free from Egyptian bondage. Likewise, it is for this reason that Jesus began his public ministry by proclaiming, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because God has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. God has sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners and recovery of sight for the blind, to set the oppressed free, to proclaim the acceptable year of the Lord." Furthermore, by bringing the voices of the subjugated and oppressed to the forefront of our knowing, we create the opportunity for not only expanding our moral imaginary regarding what justice looks like, but also expanding our empathetic capacity. There is no soil more fertile in which stereotypes and even hate can fester and grow for another, and thus a lack of empathy can take root, than the soil of separation and division. Where there is isolation from our fellow humans, theologian Howard Thurman says, fears and prejudices take root, and I add, and one's empathetic capacity is eroded. And so it is that we are called into solidarity with what I might call an empathetic solidarity with those for whom there is the least empathetic regard. It is indeed in such solidarity that we become more human, and thus our empathetic capacity overall can be increased. This, my friends, is the message, believe it or not, of the cross, calling us not into the false hope of suffering, but into the hope that is empathetic solidarity. That Jesus was crucified reveals his utter empathetic solidarity with the crucified classes of people in his day, revealing the extent to which he entered into their pain and suffering. In this regard, the crucifixion does not call us into suffering as if suffering itself is redemptive. It does not call those who suffer from crucifying realities to make peace with their suffering. Rather, it reveals Jesus' deep understanding and identification with their suffering and pain. In the words of John Sobrino, the cross reflects Jesus' quality of identification with their experience. It is for this reason that the black enslaved could sing with passion, "Were you there when they crucified my Lord?" affirming not only their identification with Jesus on the cross, but also Jesus' identification with them in their crucifying realities of enslavement. Now, when it comes to the privileged and powerful caste, those raised white, that Jesus was crucified calls them into empathetic solidarity with the subjugated and oppressed. That means it calls them to enter into spaces of discomfort, letting go of whatever would separate them from seeing the humanity of the crucified, so that, like Jesus, they too are able to have a quality of identification with the experience of the oppressed, opening the possibility for a restoration of their own empathetic capacity, opening the way to reclaim their humanity. In the final analysis, it is through the experiences of the oppressed as they struggle for freedom that the vision of God's future is kept alive, as it challenges the gaze that stifles our moral imaginary and diminishes our empathetic capacity. And so, back to the question put to me most often by young people of color: where do you find hope? My answer to them is the answer I gave to my son when he asked a similar question. And so I will end this evening where I ended my own search for hope in my book, Resurrection Hope. How really do you keep hoping? My son asked. I answered him by telling him about his great-great-grandmother. We called her Mama Mary. Mama Mary was born into slavery. She died when I was around 6 years old. Every time I think of Mama Mary, I think of those black people who were born into slavery, died in slavery, and never drew a free breath. In fact, they never dreamt that they would ever breathe a free breath. Yet, they fought for freedom anyhow. They fought for a freedom that they knew they would never see, but still believed that it would in fact one day become reality. They fought for a freedom that was nothing less than the freedom that is the justice of God, the promise of God's just future. Their struggle, their fight, was their hope in the possibilities for new life, a new life of freedom, not for themselves, but for the children they would never see. Where do I find hope? I find hope when I carry forth the legacy of hope that was my enslaved forebears, refusing as they did to give in to that which would deny and destroy Black life. I find hope in the actions of others as they respond to the urgency of hope in our time to create a future where Black lives will matter. Thank you.
We have a few moments now for questions. If you have a question you'd like to ask Dr. Douglas, you can raise your hand, signal, and a seminary student with a microphone. Yes, we'll come and give you the mic.
Hello,
Hello.
I'm Shannon Craigo-Snell, professor of theology here at Louisville Presbyterian Theological Seminary. So I am asking a selfish question, and it's also a greedy one for all the fledgling theologians and experienced theologians in this room. You have not just written a great book in Resurrection Hope. Over the course of your career, you have kind of created a unique theological genre. Your books start with something hurting a community now. They offer theological context, doctrine, normally Christology, and then go do this now. Other people don't do that.
I don't know.
And in terms of white ways of knowing, getting a PhD and then going on to be a professor, studying in a historically white institution like this one, although we're working hard, there is a way in which the norms of white knowing are enforced.
That's right.
And you have found a way to develop a new theological genre. How did you do that?
Well, first of all, I am humbled that you think so, and I thank you for that. Because I had those folks who went before me and took me on and mentored me, namely James Cone, right? When I came through, there was really nowhere that you could go and study and do the work you wanted to do from out of your experience other than with James Cone at Union. And James Cone, his own commitment to Black freedom meant that he opened the doors and made his first priority that of taking Black students who wanted to do doctoral study. It was James Cone who, in fact, someone introduced me to his work. My professor, dean of the chapel at Denison University, where I was a student, Dave Woodyard, introduced me to his work at my own time of another time of existential despair. And I said, you know what, I don't know if Christianity has anything to do with my Blackness. And I was ready to give it up. And he introduced me to James Cone's Black Theology of Liberation. And I always say, I read that book twice in one setting because I said something must be either wrong with the book or the man that gave it to me, because the man that gave it to me was white, and James Cone's talking about white is of the Antichrist. I said, something's wrong here. But, that you say I do that, I'm honored and humbled, but it's because doors were open and I had someone who support and affirmed and always said this to me, as he did to his other students. James Cone would always say he had this high voice. He said, Kelly, he'd say, find your own voice. Find your voice. And he never let that go, right? And because of that, and he also was the one that brought me into the Society of Study of Black Religion. And that becomes so important, to be amongst colleagues that look like you, that have the same commitments and that are trying to do the same kind of theological work that makes sense to who they are. So, if I've done what you've said I've done, it's not that I've done it on my own. It's because of people who have paved the way and opened the space and told me, find your own voice, and then putting me in a context like the Society of Study of Black Religion when I was a young scholar that would help me to do that. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
My name's Galen Zavala-Sherby. I'm the son of one of the students here at the Theological Seminary.
Oh, great.
I'm really glad I was able to hear this. It was phenomenal. So my question is, you mentioned at one point in your discourse Dr. King's kind of condemnation of gradualism. And I feel, as someone that's been raised up in the church, I respect that upbringing. But so often in many congregations, there's a lot of pretty words about what's happening, but there's very often not a putting forward of concrete social, economic, and political demands, and kind of an implicit separation between, our faith is over here and the politics is over here, and we don't mix the two when the two have to be connected. How can we exhort congregations and the church in general, whatever denomination it may be, to develop an active political critique of the society that we live in, and not say, we'll just gradually get to where we need to be, but say, we need that now, we needed it yesterday. How can we work on that?
Yeah, first of all, thank you for that, because that is the question, and you've put your finger right on the core of the problem. And you sound like my son. That's why I had to write this book. You are right about our churches. And I want to say two things to that. One, to call ourselves church is aspirational. We need to live into what it means to be church. We need to live into what it means to be people of faith. And that's not about doctrine. That's not about dogma. To have faith is to believe, really believe, in the promise of God's just future so that you partner with God in making that future a possibility. That's faith. The other thing when you say, how they put their faith over here and they don't get into the political, and that means they aren't being church. And here's what it means to begin to live into being church. You see, here's the thing. The Christian church has a daggone crucifixion at the center. We need to start acting like it. And here's the thing. Jesus was not crucified because he prayed too much. Maybe prayer helped him go to the cross, but it wasn't what put him on it. The cross stands for the fact that Jesus, with his utter solidarity to the crucifying classes of people, stood over and against the political, the social, and the ecclesiastical structures and systems that indeed were not just in a barrier to the gospel that our churches claim that they believe in. And so I don't even know how you can claim to be church and not be political,
Absolutely.
So you remind your church about the cross. I mean, Good Friday's getting ready to come on up here. And so there, that's the center of our faith.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
In a week, we're going to be celebrating a lynching.
Yes, that's right.
He wasn't hung on the tree. He was nailed to the tree. And I'd like to just give a shout out to Central Presbyterian, where our pastor, Ann Dybert, has gotten us quite accustomed to talking about Jesus being lynched. I think it's time to call it what it is.
Yeah, well, of course, the previous Grawemeyer winner, which makes my receiving of this Grawemeyer even more meaningful to me, and I can't talk about it for too long because I'll cry, was my mentor and friend, James Cone. And he won the Grawemeyer in 2018 for his book, The Cross and the Lynching Tree.
That's what we started.
Yep. And so you're right, and what we are challenged to do is to recognize our 21st century lynchings and crucifixions, right? And make sure that we are not with the folks who are saying, crucify him, not with the lynching mob. But we are with Jesus on that cross in solidarity with those crucified folks, trying to move us to a future that doesn't crucify, that doesn't lynch. So you are right. And if others have not read The Cross and the Lynching Tree, I really commend that book to you. Thank you for that. And Dr. Mayfield says we have time for one more. Oh, and I see back there.
Good evening.
Good evening.
As a graduate of the Marriage and Family Therapy program here at Louisville Seminary, my quest had always been to exploit the intersection of the theological and the therapeutic. And I apologize to a few of my professors in here because I was pretty persistent about that process. What I've learned in this process, and I agree with you wholeheartedly, that our suffering is not always purposive. And that was part of the challenge that I had with that intersection of the theological and the therapeutic. I've learned in the process of the evolution, I can help people with the therapeutic side of developing those coping skills to manage what's happening until we get there. And you've already answered this young man's fabulous question of one of the ways that we can influence the theological part of how we get there. And I was hoping that you might be able to offer additional steps to helping us move forward more practically, because there are spaces where this conversation isn't welcome. In academia, it's very, very welcome. In the practical application of what we do in the world, theologically and in church-based spaces, it's not necessarily always welcome. And so I get a lot of clients who come to me with church hurt and don't know what to do with those feelings while we wait. So I can help them with the coping skills. I'm hoping you can speak to some of the other practical steps we can take.
Yeah, well, thank you for your work, and thank you for your question. You'll know that I have the answers in terms of who you are as a therapist and the therapeutic skills, but this I do know, the first step to helping anyone through their trauma, and I'm going to say something about this trauma in a moment, is recognizing it and getting to the root of it, right? And what we are talking about, and what more people are beginning to talk about, is racialized trauma, right? And the fact that when we talk about the legacy of slavery, which I think is the legacy of white supremacy, what we are talking about is also a legacy being handed down from generation to generation of trauma. And here's what we know. Recent studies have just come out from, I think it was from Harvard, and someone said that they heard them talking about it on NPR not too long ago, but certainly it has been in the news over the past couple of weeks, that have suggested, they did these studies initially, I believe, to disprove, continue to have to disprove that there's a difference between a black child's brain and a white child's brain or whatever, to disprove some of the stereotypes. But what they found was that there were actual changes that were occurring in black children because of the trauma and the stress under which they live daily. And that the results of that will make them more vulnerable to suicidality, mental health concerns, etc. So the first thing we have to do, and I think our churches have to do, is to begin to recognize that there is this legacy of racialized trauma. The other thing that, and I've spoken to theologically, that we have to recognize is that no, there's no health, if you will, or well-being that can come out of suffering. Suffering brings trauma. And so we have to name that, know that, and then I think that's at least the first steps. And you're the therapist and training the therapist, at least to begin to get us on the pathway of helping those who indeed find their well-being traumatized, if you will, by the realities of suffering and the legacy of white supremacy that is trauma. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Douglas. We have books for sale in the foyer if you would like to purchase one, and Dr. Douglas will be out there momentarily to sign any books that you have. So thank you for coming this evening, and we give our thanks to the 2023 Grawemeyer winner in religion.